So what's designed for the future, the upgrade procedure? So maybe for Noland,
Yeah.
what would the upgrade look like? It was essentially what you're mentioning. Is there a way to upgrade sort of the device internally, where you take it apart and sort of keep the capsule and upgrade the internals?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things here. So for Nolan, if we were to upgrade, what we would have to do is either cut the threads or extract the threads, depending on kind of the situation there in terms of how they're anchored or scarred in. If you were to remove them with the dural substitute, you have an intact brain, so you can reinsert different threads with the updated implant package. There are a couple different other ways that we're thinking about the future of what the upgradable system looks like. One is, at the moment we currently remove the dura, this kind of thick layer that protects the brain, but that actually is the thing that actually proliferates the scar tissue formation. So typically, the general good rule of thumb is you want to leave the nature as is and not disrupt it as much. So we're looking at ways to insert the threads through the dura, which comes with different set of challenges, such as, it's a pretty thick layer. So how do you actually penetrate that without breaking the needle? So we're looking at different needle design for that, as well as the kind of the loop engagement. The other biggest challenges are it's quite opaque optically with white light illumination. So how do you avoid still this biggest advantage that we have of avoiding vasculature? How do you image through that? How do you actually still mediate that? So there are other imaging techniques that we're looking at to enable that. But the goal, our hypothesis is that, and based on some of the early evidence that we have, doing through the dura insertion will cause minimal scarring that causes them to be much easier to extract over time. And the other thing that we're also looking at, this is going to be a fundamental change in the implant architecture, is at the moment, it's a monolithic single implant that comes with a thread that's bonded together, so you can't actually separate the thing out. But you can imagine having two-part implant. Bottom part that is the thread that are inserted, that has the chips and maybe a radio and some power source, and then you have another implant that has more of the computational heavy load and the bigger battery. And then one can be under the dura, one can be above the dura, like being the plug for the skull. They can talk to each other, but the thing that you want to upgrade, the computer and not the threads, if you want to upgrade that, you just go in there, remove the screws and then put in the next version, and you're off to, it's a very, very easy surgery too. Like you do a skin incision, slip this in, screw, probably be able to do this in 10 minutes.
So that would allow you to reuse the threads, sort of.
Correct.
So, I mean, this leads to the natural question of what is the pathway to scaling the increase in the number of threads? Is that a priority? Is that like what's the technical challenge there?
Yeah, that is a priority. So for next versions of the implant, the key metrics that we're looking to improve are number of channels, just recording from more and more neurons. We have a pathway to actually go from currently 1,000 to hopefully 3,000, if not 6,000 by end of this year.
Wow.
And then end of next year, we want to get to, even more, 16,000.
Wow.
There's a couple limitations to that. One is, obviously being able to photolithographically print those wires. As I mentioned, it's 2 micron in width and spacing. Obviously, there are chips that are much more advanced than those types of resolution, and we have some of the tools that we have brought in-house to be able to do that. So traces will be narrower, just so that you have to have more of the wires coming up into the chip. Chips also cannot linearly consume more energy as you have more and more channels. So there's a lot of innovations in the circuit, and architecture as well as the circuit design topology to make them lower power. You need to also think about, if you have all of these spikes, how do you send that off to the end application? So you need to think about bandwidth limitation there and potentially innovations in signal processing. Physically, one of the biggest challenges is going to be the interface. It's always the interface that breaks. Bonding this thin film array to the electronics, it starts to become very, very highly dense interconnects. So how do you connectorize that? There's a lot of innovations in kind of the 3D integrations in the recent years that we can take advantage of. One of the biggest challenges that we do have is, forming this hermetic barrier, right? This is an extremely harsh environment that we're in, the brain. So how do you protect it from, like the brain trying to kill your electronics to also your electronics leaking things that you don't want into the brain, and that forming that hermetic barrier is going to be a very, very big challenge that we, I think are actually well suited to tackle.
How do you test that? Like, what's the development environment?
Yeah,
to simulate that kind of harshness.
Yeah, so this is where the accelerated life tester essentially is a brain in a vat.
Mm-hmm.
It literally is a vessel that is made up of, and again, for all intents and purpose for this particular types of tests, your brain is a salt water,
mm-hmm.
and you can also put some other set of chemicals like reactive oxygen species that get at kind of these interfaces and trying to cause a reaction to pull it apart. But you could also increase the rate at which these interfaces are aging by just increasing temperature. So every 10 degrees Celsius that you increase, you're basically accelerating time by 2x. And there's a limit as to how much temperature you want to increase, because at some point there's some other nonlinear dynamics that causes you to have other nasty gases to form that just is not realistic in an environment. So what we do is we increase in our ALT chamber by 20 degrees Celsius. That increases the aging by four times. So essentially 1 day in ALT chamber is 4 days in calendar year. Mm-hmm. And we look at whether the implants still are intact, including the threads and
operation and all of that.
It obviously is not an exact same environment as a brain, because brain has mechanical, other more biological goops that attack at it. But it is a good testing environment for at least the enclosure and the strength of the enclosure. And I mean, we've had implants, the current version of the implant that has been in there for, close to 2.5 years, which is equivalent to a decade, and they seem to be fine.
So it's interesting that the brain. So basically, close approximation is warm salt water. Hot salt water is a good testing environment.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm drinking Element, which is basically salt water, which is making me kind of. It doesn't have computational power the way the brain does, but maybe in terms of other characteristics, it's quite similar. Yeah. And I'm consuming it.
You have to get it in the right pH too.
And then consciousness will emerge.
Yeah.
No. All right.
But by the way, the other thing that also is interesting about our enclosure is, if you look at our implant, it's not your common-looking medical implant that usually is encased in a titanium can that's laser welded. We use this polymer called PCTFE, polychlorotrifluoroethylene, which is actually commonly used in blister packs. So when you have a pill and you're trying to pop the pill, there's like kind of that plastic membrane. That's what this is. No one's actually ever used this except us. And the reason we wanted to do this is because it's electromagnetically transparent. So when we talked about the electromagnetic inductive charging with titanium can, usually if you want to do something like that, you have to have a sapphire window, and it's a very, very tough process to scale.
So you're doing a lot of iteration here in every aspect of this: the materials, the software, the hardware, all
the whole shebang.
So you mentioned scaling. Is it possible to have multiple Neuralink devices as one of the ways of scaling? To have multiple Neuralink devices implanted?
That's the goal. Yeah, we've had. Our monkeys have had 2 Neuralinks, one in each hemisphere, and then we're also looking at potential of having one in motor cortex, one in visual cortex, and one in wherever other cortex.
So focusing on the particular function, one Neuralink device.
Correct.
I wonder if there's some level of customization that can be done on the compute side. So for the motor cortex,
absolutely. That's the goal. And we talk about at Neuralink building a generalized neural interface to the brain. And and that also is strategically how we're approaching this with marketing and also with regulatory, which is, hey, look, we have the robot, and the robot can access any part of the cortex. Right now, we're focused on motor cortex with current version of the N1 that's specialized for motor decoding tasks. But also at the end of the day, there's kind of a general compute available there. But typically, if you want to really get down to kind of hyper optimizing for power and efficiency, you do need to get to some specialized function, right? But what we're saying is that, hey, you are now used to this robotic insertion techniques, which took many years of showing data and conversation with the FDA, and also internally convincing ourselves that this is safe. And now the difference is that if we go to other parts of the brain, like visual cortex, which we're interested in as our second product, obviously it's a completely different environment. The cortex is laid out very, very differently. It's going to be more stimulation focused rather than recording, just kind of creating visual percepts. But in the end, we're using the same thin film array technology. We're using the same robot insertion technology. We're using the same, packaging technology. Now it's more the conversation is focused around what are the differences and what are the implications of those differences in safety and efficacy.
The way you said second product is both hilarious and awesome to me. That product being restoring sight for blind people. So can you speak to stimulating the visual cortex? I mean, the possibilities there are just incredible, to be able to give that gift back to people who don't have sight or even any aspect of that. Can you just speak to the challenges of, there's several challenges here.
Oh, many.
One of which is, like you said, from recording to stimulation. Just any aspect of that you're both excited and see the challenges of.
Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying that we actually have been capable of stimulating through our thin film array as well as our electronics for years. We have actually demonstrated some of that capabilities for reanimating the limb in the spinal cord. Obviously for the current EFS study, we've hardware disabled that, so that's something that we wanted to embark as a separate journey. And obviously there are many different ways to write information into the brain. The way in which we're doing that is through electrical, passing electrical current and kind of causing that to really change the local environment so that you can sort of artificially cause kind of the neurons to depolarize in nearby areas. For vision specifically, the way our visual system works, it's both well understood. I mean, anything with kind of brain, there are aspects of it that's well understood, but in the end, like, we don't really know anything. But the way visual system works is that you have photon hitting your eye, and in your eyes, there are these specialized cells called photoreceptor cells that convert the photon energy into electrical signals, and then that then gets projected to your back of your head, your visual cortex. It goes through actually a thalamic system called LGN that then projects it out. And then in the visual cortex, there's visual area 1 or V1, and then there's a bunch of other higher level processing layers like V2, V3. And there are actually kind of interesting parallels. And when you study the behaviors of these convolutional neural networks, like what the different layers of the network is detecting, first they're detecting like these edges, and they're then detecting some more natural curves, and then they start to detect like objects, right? Kind of similar thing happens in the brain. And a lot of that has been inspired, and also, it's been kind of exciting to see some of the correlations there. But things like from there, where does cognition arise, and where's color encoded? There's just not a lot of fundamental understanding there. So in terms of kind of bringing sight back to those that are blind, there are many different forms of blindness. There's actually 1 million people in the US that are legally blind. That means like certain like score below in kind of the visual test. I think it's something like if you can see something at 20 feet distance that normal people can see at 200 feet distance, like if you're worse than that, you're legally blind.
So fundamentally, that means you can't function effectively
Correct.
using sight in the world.
Yeah, like to navigate your environment. And yeah, there are different forms of blindness. There are forms of blindness where there's some degeneration of your retina, these photoreceptor cells, and rest of your visual processing that I described is intact. And for those types of individuals, you may not need to maybe stick electrodes into the visual cortex. You can actually build retinal prosthetic devices that actually just replaces the function of that retinal cells that are degenerated. And there are many companies that are working on that. But that's a very small slice, albeit significant, still smaller slice of folks that are legally blind. If there's any damage along that circuitry, whether it's in the optic nerve or just the LGN circuitry or any break in that circuit, that's not going to work for you. And the source of where you need to actually cause that visual percept to happen, because your biological mechanism is not doing that, is by placing electrodes in the visual cortex in the back of your head. And the way in which this would work is that you would have an external camera, whether it's something as unsophisticated as a GoPro, or some sort of wearable Ray-Ban type glasses that Meta's working on, that captures a scene, right? And that scene is then converted to a set of electrical impulses or stimulation pulses that you would activate in your visual cortex through these thin film arrays. And by playing some concerted kind of orchestra of these stimulation patterns, you can create what's called phosphenes, which are these kind of white yellowish dots that you can also create by just pressing your eyes. You can actually create those percepts by stimulating the visual cortex. And the name of the game is really have many of those and have those percepts the phosphenes be as small as possible, so that you can start to tell apart, like they're the individual pixels of the screen, right? So if you have many of those, potentially you'll be able to in the long term be able to actually get naturalistic vision. But in the like short term to maybe midterm, being able to at least be able to have object detection algorithms run on your glasses, the pre-processing units, and then being able to at least see the edges of things so you don't bump into stuff.
This is incredible. This is really incredible. So you basically would be adding pixels, and your brain would start to figure out what those pixels mean.
Yeah.
And like with different kinds of assistant on the signal processing on all fronts.
Yeah. The thing that actually, so a couple things. One is, obviously if you're blind from birth, the way brain works, especially in the early age, neuroplasticity is really nothing other than, kind of your brain and different parts of your brain fighting for the limited territory.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, very, very quickly you see cases where, people that are, I mean, you also hear about people who are blind that have heightened sense of hearing or some other senses. And the reason for that is because that cortex that's not used just gets taken over by these different parts of the cortex. So for those types of individuals, I mean, I guess they're going to have to now map some other parts of their senses into what they call vision, but it's going to be obviously a very, very different conscious experience. So I think that's an interesting caveat. The other thing that also is important to highlight is that we're currently limited by our biology in terms of the wavelength that we can see. There's a very, very small wavelength that is a visible light wavelength that we can see with our eyes. But when you have an external camera with this BCI system, you're not limited to that. You can have infrared, you can have UV, you can have whatever other spectrum that you want to see. And whether that gets mapped to some sort of weird conscious experience, I have no idea. But when oftentimes I talk to people about the goal of Neuralink being going beyond the limits of our biology. That's sort of what I mean.
And if you're able to control the kind of raw signal, is that when we use our sight, we're getting the photons, and there's not much processing on it. If you're be able to control that signal, maybe you can do some kind of processing. Maybe you do object detection ahead of time.
Yeah.
You're doing some kind of pre-processing, and there's a lot of possibilities to explore that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just increasing sort of thermal imaging, that kind of stuff, but it's also just doing some kind of interesting processing.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, my theory of how like visual system works also is that, I mean, there's just so many things happening in the world, and there's a lot of photons that are going into your eye, and it's unclear exactly where some of the pre-processing steps are happening. But I mean, I actually think that just from a fundamental perspective, there's just so much. The reality that we're in, if it's a reality, is so. There's so much data, and I think humans are just unable to actually like eat enough actually to process all that information. So there's some sort of filtering that does happen, whether that happens in the retina, whether that happens in different layers of the visual cortex, unclear. But like the analogy that I sometimes think about is, you know, if your brain is a CCD camera and all of the information in the world is a sun, and when you try to actually look at the sun with the CCD camera, it's just going to saturate the sensors, right? Because it's an enormous amount of energy. So what you do is you end up adding these filters, right, to just kind of narrow the information that's coming to you and being captured. And I think, you know, things like our experiences or our you know, like drugs like propofol, that like anesthetic drug, or, you know, psychedelics, what they're doing is they're kind of swapping out these filters and putting in new ones or removing older ones and kind of controlling our conscious experience.
Yeah, man, not to distract from the topic, but I just took a very high dose of ayahuasca in the Amazon jungle. So yes, it's a nice way to think about it. You're swapping out different experiences, and with Neuralink being able to control that, primarily at first to improve function, not for entertainment purposes or enjoyment purposes, but
yeah, giving back lost functions.
Giving back lost functions, and there,
that's
especially
the goal,
when the function is completely lost,
mm-hmm.
anything is a huge help.